Colonel Douglas Macgregor, some generations back a compatriot of mine, I'm very proud to say, is a retired US Army colonel, author and defence and foreign policy consultant, and a man who should be high in the ranks of the American government, but isn't. But your compensation is he's with us now. Colonel Macgregor, let's start with the diplomatic front, if you'll permit me. There are many wheels moving faster and faster now, and they're not involving the European Union, they're not involving Zelensky, not involving Starmer. Where are these wheels headed, do you think?
Well, first, let me say that you're a tough act to follow, George. I listened to your opening remarks, and they were great. We have to keep in mind that what's happening is very, very straightforward. It's not readily apparent to everybody in the United States, or for that matter, I imagine, in Western Europe. But the truth is that Ukraine, its army, its state are disintegrating. That's not a secret, as you've pointed out. Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people here who don't get it. And that's in part because you have numerous retired 3-, 4-star generals showing up on television to tell everybody that things are just fine and with a little more money, Ukraine can win. Pretty soon it'll be impossible to conceal the disaster. But the failure of Ukraine and the Ukraine project, the proxy war against Russia, is also leading to something else that you talked about, and that's the disintegration of NATO. And with NATO, the European Union. And your point about the absence of any focus on either the EU or NATO at this point, any serious focus, reflects the reality. The President of the United States has no intention of attending the NATO summit meeting next week. I think it's next week, because he doesn't need to. There's nothing to talk about. And the people in NATO have actually marginalized themselves to the point where, frankly, whatever they think or whatever they try to do doesn't matter. NATO is a bluff. It's an empty bluff. And no one in their right mind, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, in Great Britain or France or Germany or anywhere else that I can think of, wants to suddenly join the sinking ship of Ukraine and march east to stop the Russians from advancing. There's no interest in that whatsoever. And Putin has turned out to have exercised patience and been very smart and restrained the use of force only to the point where he needs to employ it. And this is now becoming very, very clear. I think, finally, the Kushner-Witkoff visit was a reflection of the people that ultimately control and dominate Donald Trump. But they were trying to rescue something from the wreckage of Ukraine. They were trying to give President Trump an excuse to show up with President Putin and sign some document that would then confer some degree of gratitude and legitimacy on President Trump for having brought the war in Ukraine to an end. I guess this would have been his 19th war or 20th war, whatever he says. That's not going to happen. And that's not because Mr. Putin wasn't willing to cooperate. He'd be happy to throw a bone to Donald Trump and say, here you go, President Trump. But he can't do it because there's nothing left to throw. So the game is up. It's over. And everything that you described, the picture you painted, could not be more accurate. We're all going to stand around and sort of watch a lot of people go down the drain. And frankly, we really ought to celebrate, because the people you're talking about deserve to go down the drain quickly.
It has been a catastrophic misjudgment, and I'm not an educated man like you. I left school at 16. If I could see on day one how this was going to end, it is astounding to me that all these exceedingly clever, or at least exceedingly well-educated fools in the governments of Western countries were simply unable to see it. You and I have been talking since the beginning of the war, and whilst the words change, the underlying meaning has never changed. That Russia, existentially threatened by this, could not lose. I mean, literally could not lose, because if they lost, they were over, and therefore would use any and everything that they had to avoid losing, just as the US would if faced with a conventional military threat from Mexico or from Canada. Why do you think the misjudgment has been so great, Colonel?
Well, the first answer is money. Money is responsible for a great deal. Do you think all of these retired generals and politicians that are piling on to talk about support for Ukraine and Ukraine within a few more inches of victory, if they only get a little bit more money, is not a function of money? Of course it is. These people are on the payroll. They've all been rewarded handsomely for years by the various banking interests in the city of London, New York City, everybody in Washington in one form or another. And I suppose this is probably true in your country as well. But it's certainly the case in Washington. Almost everybody's on the payroll for someone. Some lobbyist somewhere is funneling money to people, and they respond to the gift, the financial gratuities. It's depressing. But there's another reason, and that is there's a false sense of absolute superiority in the United States. People are absolutely convinced that they cannot be challenged, that we are invulnerable, invincible. And the fragile economy, which is nothing more than another shell game financially, that's all going to collapse pretty soon as well, has been concealed from the American public. In a lot of ways, the arrogance in Washington is comparable to the arrogance in London in 1914, when large numbers of otherwise educated people were very stupid and entered that war when they never needed to get into it. And the British Empire, in my judgment, really began dying in great numbers on the battlefields of the First World War. It never really recovered. The Second World War simply finished it off. Nobody was thinking about the number one interest that should guide everyone's behavior. That is the survival of the state and the people that live in it. That's your number one concern. And anybody with that concern would not have behaved as these people in NATO have. They have demonstrated no interest in the survival of their own peoples, their own culture, their own identity. Nothing. They are all part of the globalist scam designed to extract as much money as possible and put it in their pockets and enrich them while their own populations and their own countries go to hell.
Indeed, and not even paved with good intentions. It's been a road ill-intentioned and corrupted, as you say, right from the beginning. So what now, Colonel? I mean, it seems to me that Trump is just allowing this war to continue, knowing that the direction is only one way. He dodged, or Kushner dodged, Witkoff dodged a meeting with Zelensky today. They are not interested in further talks about Ukraine. They're more into now post-war relations between the US and Russia. I won't embarrass them by giving their names, but the last time I was in Moscow, it was filled with Donald Trump-type Americans. They're all there trying to get to the front of the queue for the new post-world order. Some household names are now actually living and working in Moscow, mostly below the radar, but not entirely. It seems to me that Trump, true to type, is he's probably negotiating a Trump Tower in Moscow right now.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Greed triumphs over reason at every turn. I'm sure he's not doing it, but it could be one of his sons. Let's be frank, that's been an ongoing problem. Witkoff's son, everybody's family is involved, once again, in enriching themselves. It's just shameless corruption. But there's something else happening, and that is there's an awareness that this thing called NATO and the EU are effectively irrelevant now. Now, that's a fault in large measure of Donald Trump. Donald Trump always had the power, as soon as he was elected, as the leader of NATO, to step in and sit down with the Europeans and say, look here, this can't go any further. This must end. None of us have an interest in going to war with Russia. We need to normalize relations with Russia. This man, Zelensky, needs to go. We need to put a new government in there. We need to end this war as soon as possible because, frankly, it's dangerous to us. He never did that. In fact, he's ultimately done the opposite. He said, I'm abdicating my responsibility for leadership of NATO. If you Europeans want to carry on the war, well, I'll sell you whatever you'd like to have. You may not see it for 2, 3, or 4 years, but I'll be happy to take your money. What a terrible thing to say. What a catastrophe for the American people in Europe. There was no sense of obligation to humanity, just as we've seen no sensitivity whatsoever to the mass murder and expulsion of human beings from the West Bank and Gaza. We've seen the same thing towards Ukraine. What difference does it make how many Ukrainians die? And oh, by the way, we can always lie and say the number's half of what's reported. All of that's beginning to go away. And in the meantime, Donald Trump thinks he can rescue the petrodollar by gaining control of Venezuela's oil resources, because it certainly doesn't have anything to do with drugs. There aren't enough drugs to keep London high for a week coming out of that place. So I think Donald Trump has made serious mistakes. He's been revealed for what he is. It's tragic because a lot of us supported the man because he said the right things, but he hasn't done the right things.
Well, when all is said and done, there's a lot more said than done in politics, Colonel. Just if I may change course, the standoff in the Caribbean, about which I've seen you opine, would I be way out of line in saying that the danger of American invasion is less now than it seemed a few days ago? I note that the Russians and the Chinese have restored their air services. Whatever Donald Trump says about no-fly zones and the rest, people are saying that some of the naval assets of the U.S. have returned to Puerto Rico and are no longer off the coast of Venezuela. I have been amongst those prominent in sounding the alert of an imminent American invasion. This evening, I'm not as sure it's going to happen as I feared a couple of days ago. What's your take?
I sincerely hope you're correct. The problem is twofold. First of all, and I've done this before, I've compared it to the Normandy landings. You can't assemble a large force that you're prepared to throw at your opponent and let it sit for days, weeks, and months. At some point, you've either got to use it or not use it. Eisenhower was trapped into using it. He had no choice. They'd built this thing up over many months and weeks. Everyone was ready to go. The weather wasn't perfect. They knew it was going to turn bad, but you had to go. He went. I have been worried that that would happen to Donald Trump. Now, it is not impossible that someone other than his inner circle has sat down with him and pointed out some facts. First of all, Venezuela is huge. It's the size of France, Germany, and Austria combined. There are 30 million people living there. At least half or more of it is triple canopy jungle. Certainly the border, 1,380 miles with Brazil, is almost impenetrable. There are only a couple of places you can actually cross the border. Colombia, heavily mountainous, very difficult to cross through there, although there are more points. And now you risk the war turning into something that you never wanted, which is a Latino crusade against the evil white Yankees who've come once again into Latin America to exploit them. You know, what a disaster. We need that like we need an extra hole bored somewhere. So, you know, the bottom line is, I hope someone has gotten to him and pointed these things out, because even if you were able to go in quickly, even if you were able to identify all the air and missile defense sites, all the radars, hit all the airfields, let the Marines come in and take the major international airport that's right next to the coast, and then fly in 15,000 troops from the Army to be a stabilization force, you've still got to go to Caracas. Getting to Caracas, even though it seems to be close on the map, is no easy task. It's surrounded by mountains. You've got to go through tunnels to get into the place. And if you can't use the tunnels, well, you got to fly in. Or I guess you could parachute people in. There are lots of crazy people in the United States Army that would welcome that and think that's great. But again, the opportunity for everything to go wrong is still there. We haven't even talked about putting in this Mrs. Machado. Could you actually do that? Will she survive the installation? We're assuming that you're going to get rid of Maduro easily. Well, the man never sleeps in the same place twice. You know, you don't know where he is at any given point in time. He's very well guarded. If you can't get rid of him quickly and easily, you're not going to be able to put anybody else in. And then, of course, there's the possibility that the Colombians and the Brazilians and people from across Latin America all decide to come in as guerrilla fighters to support the people in Venezuela. The whole thing, frankly, is insane. What should happen is that Donald Trump should say, you know, I've had an opportunity to talk once again with Mr. Maduro, and I now find him willing to reach an amicable solution. And so I am directing our forces to stand down. We will not rush away immediately, but we will gradually de-escalate as we see that the conditions that we've discussed with Mr. Maduro are fulfilled. I mean, that's what you say. What the hell you do is another thing. And then finally, you say, and by the way, next week I'm going to announce some new appointees, names for people who will replace the current Secretary of War, the current Secretary of State. Get a new team, put new people in there, change the direction of our country, change the strategic direction, move away from all the belligerence and bellicosity, start talking about what really counts, which is what's happening here at home. Just as you described the perilous economic conditions in Germany and France and Great Britain, they're bad here. We don't admit to it, we don't talk about it, but our position is quite fragile. Here is where he needs to function, and that's why ultimately he was elected.
Finally, and as a very senior military man yourself, you must have been dismayed at how this former Fox News disc jockey turned Secretary of War threw an admiral under the bus or under the ship over the quite patently obvious war crimes that were committed with these fishing boats. The bombing of these boats in and of itself is a crime, but returning to the scene of the crime and executing people clinging to the hull it's the kind of thing that could get you executed in certain countries. And then to blame it on the military officer when you earlier claimed that you'd watched the whole thing and gave the order, kill them all, with presidential authority, it speaks so badly of the dysfunctionality in the Oval Office, doesn't it?
I think you're understating the problem. I think it's worse than that. I think the fish always rots from the head. Let's keep that in mind. The people for whom I feel the greatest sympathy are the people that have to execute the orders at the lowest level. And contrary to what everybody believes, if you stand there as a young sergeant or a boatswain's mate or something else and you say, sir, that's an illegal order, you're likely to be told by the officers above you, this is an order, executed. If you refuse to do that, you will be arrested. And the man starts to think, well, what kind of a trial am I going to get? How am I going to be treated? Contrary to popular belief, if you're brought up on charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice in the military, good luck. You're going to have a hell of a fight to survive. And then you begin to worry about your family. I would not prosecute, as a result, the people at the lowest levels who have enormous pressure on themselves that are very vulnerable. But I would prosecute, and I'd start at the top. And the first question is, I don't know all the facts. So, the Secretary of War should be suspended pending a full investigation. Number two, the Admiral, if in fact he unhesitatingly carried out the order, he should be suspended pending an investigation and possible court-martial. Go after the people at the top. They're the ones that gave the order, if it turns out to be the case. But clearly, the inspiration for the United States Armed Forces, contrary to popular belief, is not Genghis Khan. It's a very different set of values that we talk a great deal about. And finishing off two poor, pathetic human beings hanging onto wreckage in the Caribbean Ocean, regardless of what you say they may or may not have done. And after all, we've never captured anybody. We've never interrogated anybody. We've never proven anything to be true in a court of law, let alone in a standard federal investigation. So we don't know anything. Those two people could have been escaping from the country for other reasons, or they were carrying something else. The other thing is, a lot of these boats are full of people. You don't pack a boat, a fast speedboat with lots of people, and then pile some drugs in there. Normally, you've got one or two people in the boat, and you've got the drugs in there. I mean, come on, we know this from experience. So we don't know, but what we need to find out is exactly what you described. If, in fact, the Secretary of War said, yes, kill them all, that's absolutely unacceptable to us as Americans. It violates the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He should resign. But first we need to run an investigation, find out what's true.
Wow. Big stuff. Thank you very much, as always, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, an absolute sage.
Well, it's good to see you, George.
military
It's really
and-
good to see you. It's really good to see you free and walking around as a free man for a change. So keep it up.
Thank you so much, Colonel. God bless. I hope we get to meet sometime, somewhere. Probably not in London in the near future.